Bonjour à tous.
Good
Ceux qui
afternoon,
sont
everybody,
ici en
for
présentiel
those
et ceux qui
here
sont
in
en
the
ligne.
auditorium and those
Pour cette
also attending
troisième et
online
dernière
for this
étape
third and
de la
last
conférence
chapter in the conference
organisée par la Banque de
organized
France, la
by Banque
FERDI
de France,
et
FERDI,
l'AFD
and the
sur
AFD
le rôle du système
on the
financier dans la
role
lutte
of
contre
the
le changement
financial system
climatique.
in the
Et
struggle against
on a
climate
vu
change.
dans les jours
We've
précédents
seen
quel
in
rôle
previous
pouvait jouer
days
le
what
secteur
role
privé,
the
quel
private sector
rôle
could
pouvaient
play
jouer les banques
and
de
what role
développement. Et on
development banks could
termine
play. And we're
évidemment
concluding,
par
obviously,
le rôle des
with
banques centrales
the
et le
role of
rôle
central
des
banks
régulateurs dans
and
la lutte contre le changement
regulators,
climatique.
supervisors in
Alors je
the
crois qu'on a
struggle against
entendu
climate change. Now, we've
lors
heard
des deux premiers
in the first
webinaires
two webinars
un certain nombre de
a
mots
number of
clés:
words, keywords,
alignement,
alignment,
coopération, coordination.
cooperation,
Et je crois
coordination,
que Laurent
and I
Clerc a
believe that
terminé
Laurent
le
Clerc
webinaire d'hier sur le
concluded
mot
yesterday's
collectif. Et donc la
webinar
question
with the word
évidemment
collective.
qui
And
va
now the
être posée
question,
aujourd'hui,
obviously, which will
c'est
be raised today,
est-ce que les
is
banques centrales et le régulateur bancaire, est-ce qu'ils
are
peuvent
the
être les
central
chefs
bank
d'orchestre
and the
du
regulator
secteur
the
financier pour
orchestra
la lutte contre
conductor
le
for the
changement
financial
climatique?
center in the
Est-ce
fight against
qu'ils
climate
doivent le
change?
faire? Est-ce que leur mandat le leur
Should they
permet?
do
Est-ce qu'ils
so?
peuvent
Does
le
their
faire?
mandate
Et est-ce
allow them to do
qu'ils ont
so?
des outils
Can they do
propres
so? Do they have
pour
their
le
own
faire?
tools
Je crois que c'est les
to do
questions
this?
auxquelles on va
I think
essayer
these
de
are
répondre
questions that we're
aujourd'hui,
going to try
mais je
to answer
rentre pas
today,
plus loin
but I won't go
dans le
any
sujet.
further into the
Et
subject.
avant de présenter le
And
panel, je
before
passe la
presenting
parole
the panel,
à
I'll
Laurent
hand
Clerc,
over to Laurent
qui
Claire,
va nous donner
who will give us
son angle de vue sur
his
ce sujet.
insight
Donc Laurent Clerc, qui
into
est,
this issue. So
comme
Laurent
vous
Claire,
le savez, le
as you
directeur
know,
général adjoint des
is
études de
the
la
Deputy
recherche,
Executive
des
Director
statistiques
for
et de l'international
Statistics
à la Banque
Studies
de
and
France.
International Relations at
Merci
Banque de France.
beaucoup, Bruno.
Thank you
Moi,
very
je vais
much,
aborder
Bruno.
donc dans
I'm going to start
dans ces propos
address
introductifs
in
au
these
panel le rôle
introductory
des banques
remarks
centrales et des
for the
superviseurs bancaires
role of central
dans
banks
la lutte
and
contre le changement
supervisors
climatique.
in the fight
Alors, je
against
vais
climate
utiliser
change.
les
I
précautions
will
d'usage.
use
Ce que
the
je vais
standard
vous
precautions.
présenter, c'est l'expression de mes vues personnelles
What
qui
I'm
ne
going
sont
to
pas
present is the
nécessairement celles de
expression
la
of
Banque de
my
France.
personal view, which is not
Je vais
necessarily
aborder
that
trois
of
points
the Banque de
principaux
France. I'm
qui
going to address
correspondent au mandat des
three
banques
main
centrales.
points,
Donc,
which
le
is the
premier point
mandate
sera
of
sur
central
la
banks. The first
stabilité
is
financière.
on
Le
financial
deuxième sur la
stability.
stabilité des prix. Et le
The second one is
troisième,
on price
c'est le
stability.
rôle des
And
banques centrales
thirdly,
comme
the role of
gestionnaires
central banks
d'actifs
as asset
ou
managers
investisseurs responsables.
or responsible
Alors,
investors.
l'ordre que j'ai retenu n'est pas l'ordre
The
de
order
choix,
I
puisque
have taken
généralement on
is
commence
not a
par la
standard
stabilité
order
des
because
prix.
we normally start off with
Je
price
vais aller
stability.
dans un ordre qui est
I'll go in an
celui de la
order
controverse,
that
donc
is that of
du moins controversé au
controversy,
plus
or at
controversé.
least
Je vais commencer
the
par
a slightly controversial approach.
le
I
rôle
will
des banques
begin
centrales et
with the
puis la
role of
stabilité
central banks
financière. Alors, c'est
and
vrai
financial
que
stability.
c'est un point qui a été
It's
abordé lors
true
des
that
deux
this was
premiers
an issue
webinaires
addressed in the first
sur
two webinars
les fonctions, les mandats. On a
regarding
déjà
the
pu voir
functions and
qu'ils
mandates,
étaient
and
très
we've
différents en
seen
fonction
that
des
they were
pays.
very different from
Ce
one
que je
country
voulais
to
dire,
the
c'est que
next.
les banques
What I
centrales sont
wanted to
intervenues
say
assez
is that
récemment dans
central
le
banks
sujet
intervened
du changement
fairly
climatique.
recently in the issue of
Euh,
climate
et
change.
quand on regarde les mandats des
And when
banques
you
centrales,
look at the mandate of central banks,
le climat ne figure pas
climate
explicitement dans le
is
mandat des
not
banques centrales.
formally included in the
C'est
central bank's mandates.
en fait
In
implicite
fact, it's
par à la
implicit
fois l'impact du changement
with
climatique
the
sur
impact
l'économie,
of climate
donc en
change on the
particulier les prix
economy,
ou l'activité,
and in
et sur la
particular
stabilité
on prices and
financière.
activity, and on financial
Alors pour les banques
stability.
centrales,
For
il y a eu
central
deux
banks,
moments
there have been two
fondateurs.
moments,
Le
founding moments.
premier, c'est le
The
discours de
first
Mark Carney,
was Mark
qui
Carney's
date de,
speech
désolé, ça coupe, qui date de septembre 2015, qui
from September
s'appelait Briser la
2015,
tragédie des
which is
horizons.
called Breaking the
Alors c'est
Tragedy of the Horizon.
un discours qui est fondateur
It's
parce
a
qu'il introduit tout
founding
d'abord une
speech
première notion
because it
qui est celle de
introduced the
tragédie des
first
horizons.
notion of the
On l'a un petit peu
tragedy of
évoqué
the
hier,
horizons.
qui est celle en fait
And we
de
mentioned this
l'écart entre
yesterday,
l'horizon de
the gap
décision
between
des
the
investisseurs,
decision
des
horizon
banquiers ou des
between
assureurs, qui est
investors,
généralement
bankers,
un
insurers,
horizon de court
which is
terme,
normally a
et
short-term
l'horizon qui est
horizon,
nécessaire
and a horizon that is
pour
necessary
investir en
to
particulier dans
invest
des
in
grosses
particular
infrastructures, qui est un
in
horizon de long
large-scale
terme.
infrastructure,
Et
in
cet
other words,
horizon de
long
long
term.
terme, c'est celui aussi
This
du
long-term
changement
horizon
climatique.
is also that of climate
Le
change.
deuxième apport important
The second important
de ce
contribution
discours, c'est
to
d'introduire
that
les
of that
catégories
speech
qu'on utilise
is
beaucoup
to introduce
à
in the
présent,
categories that
les
we use
notions de
now
risque
is
physique,
the idea of physical
de
risk,
risque de transition et de risque
transition
juridique.
risks, and
Je
legal
reviendrai un
risks.
petit peu dessus plus
I'll
tard.
go back to this a little
Alors,
later.
surtout, le point important de ce discours aussi,
Now,
c'est
above all,
finalement
the
de
important point of this
légitimer et
speech
de
is to give
crédibiliser le sujet du changement
legitimacy and
climatique pour le
credibility
secteur
to
financier.
climate change
Alors,
for
c'est
the
vrai
financial sector.
qu'auparavant,
Now, it's
C'est un
true that
sujet qui était plutôt perçu comme un peu
beforehand, the
hétérodoxe
sector was
au sein
considered
des
rather
banques centrales et peu de
heterodoxical,
banques centrales l'abordaient.
and few
Donc
central
le mérite
banks
de ce discours,
addressed
c'est
it.
de mobiliser le secteur
The
financier.
merit of this
Le
speech is
deuxième
to actually
peut-être
mobilize the sector
moment
financial
clé, c'est la
sector.
création du
Another
NGFS.
important point is the
Le
creation of
NGFS,
NGFS,
ça veut dire Network of
which
Central
is a
Bank and
network of
Supervisors
central banks
for
and
Greening the
supervisors
Financial System.
for
Alors,
greening the
c'est un réseau
financial
de banques
system.
centrales qui a été
It's a
créé
network of
en
central banks
décembre 2017
established in December
à
2017
l'initiative de la Banque de France
at
et
the
de 7
behest of
autres
Banque de
membres
France and
fondateurs,
7 other founding members,
parmi lesquels la Banque centrale du
including
Maroc
the Central
pour
Bank of
le
Morocco
continent africain.
for Africa.
Alors aujourd'hui, c'est
Today,
198 membres
we have
et
198
27 banques centrales ou
members and
superviseurs
27
africains.
supervisors and
Alors
central banks
l'intérêt de
in
ce
Africa.
réseau, c'est là
The
encore
purpose of
d'avoir
this network
mobilisé
is
les
to once
ressources,
again
les
mobilize
expertises,
resources,
et c'est une mobilisation
expertise,
sans précédent
and this is
qui porte
unprecedented
sur tous les points que je vais aborder
concerning
aujourd'hui.
all the points
Alors
that
le
I will
premier,
address
c'est
today. The
le rôle des
first
banques centrales dans le
is the
changement
role of central
climatique.
banks in climate
En
change
tant que
as
superviseurs ou garants
supervisors
de la stabilité
or
financière.
guarantors of
Alors là,
financial
c'est le rôle qui est
stability.
peut-être le moins
There again,
controversé
this is the
puisque
least controversial role
l'impact du
because
changement
the
climatique,
impact of
il est
climate change
quasiment direct
is
sur le système
basically
financier
direct
du fait
for
de
the
la
financial
nature des
system, given the
expositions et de la
nature of our
nature du
exposure
risque,
and the nature of the risks
de risque
that we
systémique,
can
au sens où
quantify or
c'est un
describe as
risque qui
systemic
affecte
risks.
tous
It's
les
a risk
acteurs, tous
that
les
affects
secteurs
all
en
players,
même temps.
all sectors at the same
Alors,
time.
dans ce contexte-là,
In
l'action de
that
la Banque
context,
centrale et du
the central
superviseur,
bank and
elle vise à
banks and
corriger une
supervisors
défaillance de marché
aim to correct
qui est la
market
faiblesse ou l'absence de
weaknesses,
prise en
or
compte
which is
du risque
the absence
climatique en
of
tant que
the
risque
consideration
financier.
of climate risks as
Donc
a
l'idée,
financial
c'est
risk.
de pallier
The
cette
idea is to
absence
offset
de prise en
this
compte du risque
lack of
par
consideration
plusieurs
for the risk
approches.
via
Celle des banques
multiple
centrales en tant
approaches.
que
That
superviseurs
of central
comporte en
banks as
particulier
supervisors
sur 3 points
concerns
principaux.
3
Il y
main
a la
points:
réglementation ou la régulation du
regulation
système
or
financier, donc c'est
of the
l'élaboration de
financial
normes.
system. In
Ça
other
peut
words, the
être
development of the standards.
la supervision, qui est le
We
deuxième
can talk
outil,
about
en particulier
supervision,
sur
which is
tout
the second part,
dispositif de gouvernance des
especially
risques.
to
Et
do
puis
with
le
risk
dernier élément,
governance.
c'est
And
la
the final
sensibilisation des
factor
acteurs
is
financiers.
awareness raising for
Alors le
financial
risque
players.
en termes de stabilité
The
financière, il se
risk
manifeste
for
par 3
financial
canaux
stability
principaux.
can be
Je
seen
les
in
ai
3
évoqués tout à
main
l'heure en
channels,
passant,
as I
mais je vais
mentioned
juste
them.
détailler
So I'll
rapidement.
just go
Il y
into more
a le
detail
risque
now.
physique.
There's a
Alors pour
physical
le
risk.
système financier,
For the
quand on
financial
parle de risque
system, when we
physique, on
talk about
évoque
a physical risk,
soit la
we mean
destruction ou la
destruction
dépréciation du
or
capital, en
depreciation of
particulier physique.
capital,
Alors c'est important
especially
dans le
physical,
secteur financier, surtout
especially in
quand ce
the
capital est
financial
utilisé comme
sector when this
collatéral
capital is used
pour
as
des
collateral
opérations financières.
for financial operations.
D'autres risques qui
Other
en
risks
découlent, c'est le risque de
which
rupture
ensue
d'activité,
is a risk
pour
of business
les entreprises, mais
breakdown,
du coup, ça va avoir
so
un
for
impact sur le
companies,
secteur des
but
assurances.
also it'll also impact the insurance
Un autre risque
profession.
particulièrement
Another risk
important
which is
pour
particularly
les
significant
pays en voie de développement,
for developing nations
c'est notamment les questions
is
d'assurabilité.
the issue of insurability.
Le webinaire précédent,
Yesterday, in the previous webinar,
l'initiative
we had
portant à développer
initiative
l'assurabilité,
concerning
en particulier dans la
assurability
zone
in
Afrique
the
occidentale.
Western African region.
L'inassurabilité, elle est vraiment
Insurability is also very important because in countries that are vulnerable, poor,
l'impact du changement
the
climatique et
impact
du
of
risque
climate
physique,
change and
ça se
physical risks
matérialise par
can
des
be
impacts qui sont
manifested
durables, voire
by
permanents,
long-term or
sur les
even permanent
infrastructures ou l'activité.
damage to
À
infrastructure
contrario
and activity,
de ce qu'on
in
observe pour
contrast
le
with
moment,
what we can
dans
see
les pays
for the time being
occidentaux,
in
où
Western
le
nations.
fait que ce risque soit assurable
The fact that this
permet
risk
tout de suite de
can
restaurer
be insured means that
l'intégralité du
we can
capital productif,
restore
voire de l'améliorer,
productive
donc on a
capital in its
presque des
entirety or
effets
even improve it. We
de
often have
destruction créatrice.
a creative destructive
Le
effect.
dernier point qui est important pour
The
le
final
risque
point
physique, c'est le
for
lien
physical
avec le
risks
risque
is
souverain,
the tie-in with
en
sovereign risks,
particulier dans les
in
pays qui
particular
dépendent beaucoup
in
de
countries
production agricole,
which
puisqu'on peut
depend
avoir
enormously
l'érosion
on
des sols,
agricultural output because
par
soil
des
erosion
phénomènes de
may occur
sécheresse ou
as a
d'inondation,
result of drought or
qui vont
flooding
dégrader à
that
la
will
fois
deteriorate both
l'activité, mais aussi les
the
ressources fiscales, et donc
activity but also
augmenter le
fiscal
risque
resources
souverain
and therefore
pour ces pays.
increase
C'est des
sovereign
phénomènes
risks
qu'on
for these
observe
countries. These are
d'ores et
phenomena
déjà.
that we've
Le
already
risque de
seen.
transition, lui, il est un peu
A
de nature
transition
différente.
risk
Il est
is
lié
slightly
soit au
different
changement de
because it
comportement, soit
relates
à la
either
mise en
to a
œuvre
change in
de règles
behavior or the
particulières.
implementation of
Et un
specific
des points
rules.
qui affecte
And one of the
particulièrement
points
le
that
secteur financier,
particularly
c'est la
impacts the
dévalorisation
financial
des
sector
actifs
is the devaluation of
standard assets. Alors
assets,
ça
what we
touche
call standard
particulièrement
assets, that
les
affects
pays
in
ou
particular
les
countries
activités qui dépendent
where
des énergies
activities
fossiles.
will
Alors, en
depend on
effet, si
fossil
on a des
fuels.
lois ou des
If
changements
there
de
are laws
comportement
or changes
qui
in
condamnent
behavior that
ces énergies ou cette
penalize
activité, bien,
that
tout
kind
le
of
secteur
activity
financier
or
qui est
energy, then
exposé
the entire financial sector
à
exposed to this
ces actifs voit
asset
de fortes
class
dépréciations.
will
Alors,
be
c'est aussi le cas
significantly
des États,
depreciated.
et
This is
dans
also
les
the
États,
case
notamment
in
en Afrique,
states,
où on a une
in
forte
particular in Africa,
dépendance
where we
des
have
banques,
a high
une
degree of
forte
dependency of banks
connexion entre le
and a
risque
strong
bancaire et le
connection
risque
between
souverain.
bank risks
C'est
and
un
sovereign
élément
risks.
supplémentaire de
This is an
fragilité.
additional fragility factor.
Alors, le risque de responsabilité, lui,
The
c'est un
responsibility
risque qui est
risk
souvent
is
associé au
one
risque de
which is very
transition.
often
Il est de
associated
nature
with
un
a
peu
transition
différente. Moi,
risk.
j'ai
It's somewhat
toujours
different.
considéré qu'il était
I've always
important
considered
de le
that
considérer
it
un
was
peu à part.
important to be
C'est un
considered
risque
somewhat
opérationnel,
apart. It's an
mais c'est un
operational
risque qui
risk,
est
but
aussi
it's also a
important
risk
parce que la
that is
plupart des
significant because
initiatives
most of the initiatives
et des mises en cause aujourd'hui
and issues
sur l'inaction portent sur les États.
in the
Donc,
lack
c'est
of
un
actions
risque
concerns
supplémentaire aussi
states. So that's an
pour
additional
pour les
factor
souverains.
for sovereign
Alors, en matière de stabilité
risks.
financière,
In terms of financial
il
stability,
y a un
however,
point qui est
there is a
particulièrement
point that
important,
is particularly important,
c'est le rôle des stress tests.
which
Donc,
is the
c'est quelque
role of
chose
stress tests.
qui
This
a
is
joué
something
aussi beaucoup.
that
Donc ça, on
had
le doit
a significant
notamment
effect.
au
We owe this
NGFS,
to the
qui
NGFS,
a permis
which
aux
made it possible
superviseurs
for
de
supervisors
disposer de
to
scénarios.
have
Je voudrais
scenarios.
juste évoquer quelques
And I just wanted to
leçons.
mention a few
Le
lessons
premier, c'est que ces
learned.
exercices sont
The first is
généralement un
that these
succès et
exercises
atteignent
are
les
generally a
objectifs,
success
en
and normally
particulier celui de
achieve
sensibilisation du
objectives,
secteur
in particular
financier
the
au risque
awareness
climatique. Ça
raising
permet
among
notamment
the financial
l'amélioration
sector,
des
which means we can
méthodologies,
improve
des modèles
methodologies,
et de la
models,
quantification des risques.
and
Ça
quantification of
permet
risks.
aussi
It
d'améliorer
also
le
makes it
suivi de la
possible
gouvernance
to
des risques
improve
et puis aussi la
the
collecte
tracking
des
of risk
données et
governance
métriques. Alors, un point
and the
important
collection of
notamment,
data and metrics.
c'est
An important
d'éclairer un
point
petit peu et
is to
de
cast
pouvoir
light
mesurer
a little
ces
and be
différentes
able
mesures
to
comme
measure
le scope 1,
these
scope
various
2, scope 3,
metrics, such
c'est-à-dire
as
les
scope 1,
différents
2,
niveaux
and 3,
d'exposition.
in other words, the various levels of
Quand on
exposure.
regarde les résultats de
When
ces
you
stress
look at
tests,
the results
les
of
résultats
the stress
quantitatifs
tests or
montrent
the quantitative
qu'effectivement,
results, this
les
shows
pertes
that
pour le secteur
that
financier, en
losses for the
particulier les
financial
banques et les
sector, in
assurances,
particular banks
sont
and insurers,
significatives, mais en
are
général, elles
significant,
n'apparaissent
but
pas aussi
also they do
systémiques
not
qu'on pourrait le croire
appear as
et
systemic as we might believe,
généralement gérables pour les
and are
institutions
normally
financières. Alors ça découle
manageable
de
for
trois
financial
choses.
institutions. This is a
La
result of
première, c'est
three
la
things.
nature des chocs
The first is the
qui sont
nature of
utilisés,
each
puisque
shock,
ces chocs n'affectent en fait
because
qu'une
these
petite
shocks,
partie du
these
portefeuille.
crises, affect only
La
a
deuxième
part of the
raison, c'est
portfolio.
l'absence d'effet
The second reason is
d'amplification.
the
Et le
absence
troisième,
of
c'est la
amplification
sévérité des
effect.
scénarios.
And thirdly, the
Alors, je ne développe
severity
pas
of the
plus, on aura
scenario.
peut-être
I
l'occasion
won't go
d'en
any
parler
further
sur le
because
même
perhaps we'll
panel.
go back to
Je vais
this
aborder
during the
mon
panel.
deuxième point
I
qui est
want to
sur
go into my second point now,
la politique monétaire.
which is monetary policy.
Donc là, c'est un domaine qui est un tout petit
This
peu
is
plus
a field
controversé,
that is somewhat more
puisque
controversial
les
as
chocs climatiques ou les événements
climate
climatiques prennent
crises
souvent
or
la forme de
climate
chocs d'offres,
factors often
donc,
become
qui sont les plus compliqués à
supply
gérer pour
shocks,
les
which
banques
are more
centrales.
complex to manage for central
Alors,
banks.
non seulement
Not
c'est des chocs
only
d'offres, mais en plus c'est des
are
chocs qui sont
they
généralement indirects,
supply
puisque
problems,
c'est
but
pas
they're also
tellement
direct
l'événement
because
climatique
it's
en
not
tant
the
que tel
climate
qui va avoir un
event as
impact, mais c'est
such
son
that will have
effet
an
sur
impact,
l'activité
but
et
its
sur les prix
effect on
qui
activity and
sont
on
dans
prices
les objectifs des
that
banques
are
centrales.
among
Alors, en
the
plus,
central
la
bank's
réaction
objectives.
politique monétaire, elle n'est pas
The
nécessairement
reaction to monetary
automatique ou
policy is not
instantanée.
always, or
Alors,
from monetary policy is
la
not always
tradition des
automatic
banques
or
centrales,
instant.
c'est de dire
The
on
policy normally
réagit pas
tradition is
au
to
choc
say we
d'offres,
don't
donc c'est ce
react
qu'on
to
appelle le
supply
look-through, donc
shocks.
on
We
regarde
look
à travers
through
du choc, puisqu'on a
we
peu
look through the shock,
de possibilités
as there are few
d'agir.
possibilities
Et puis ensuite, il
to
peut y avoir des effets
act,
désirés.
and then there may
Si
be
par exemple
desirable
j'augmente
effects.
une taxe
If I
sur le
increase the
carbone,
tax
ça va
on
avoir un effet
carbon,
négatif sur
it'll have an
l'activité.
adverse effect
C'est
on
pas pour autant que je
activity.
vais baisser les
That
taux
doesn't mean
d'intérêt,
I'm
puisque c'est
going to
précisément ce que
lower
je
the
vais faire
interest
pour
rates
réduire
because
les
that's
émissions.
what I'll do to reduce emissions.
Alors, ce qu'on a vu au cours des dernières
What
années,
we've
malgré
seen
tout,
in
c'est que la
recent years, despite
multiplication
all
des
of
chocs
this, is
d'offres, en
that
particulier au niveau
supply
global,
shocks,
a amené les banques
especially on a
centrales à
global level,
réagir,
has
en
made central
particulier
banks
parce
react,
que ces
in
chocs,
particular
lorsqu'ils
because
sont
these shocks,
suffisamment
when they are
persistants,
sufficiently
ils ont pour
persistent,
effet de désancrer les anticipations
are there
d'inflation,
to,
ce
in
qui
fact,
demande une réaction politique
decorrelate
monétaire.
inflation
Alors, réaction
effects,
politique
which means
monétaire, donc
a
ça pose la
monetary
question de l'instrument.
policy reaction,
Et là, le
which
taux
means in terms
d'intérêt
of
qu'on
instruments
utilise
there, the interest
traditionnellement dans
rate
les
that we
banques
traditionally
centrales n'est
use
pas
in
forcément
central
le
banks
meilleur instrument
is
pour
not
ça, parce
necessarily
que
the best instrument.
notamment si je veux agir de façon
Now, if I
préventive,
want
si
to act
j'augmente ou
in a
je baisse le
preventive
taux
manner,
d'intérêt,
if
ça
I
va pas
raise or lower
changer
interest
les
rates,
événements
it's not going to
climatiques.
change the
Par
climate
contre, si on
events
se pose la
themselves.
question des
However,
émissions,
if I look at the issue of
la réponse
emissions,
est un petit peu ambiguë.
the
C'est-à-dire
answer
que
is a bit more
si
ambiguous.
je fais le lien entre
In other words,
l'activité
if I
économique et
tie
les
in
émissions de
activity
CO2, j'ai
and
peut-être intérêt
CO2
à
emissions,
augmenter les taux
then
d'intérêt
it
pour
might be in my
réguler un petit
interest
peu
to
les
increase
émissions.
interest rates
Mais à
to reduce
contrario, je vais
emissions. But
pénaliser
on the
des
other hand, I'll
industries
penalize
renouvelables. Donc,
renewable energies
j'ai peut-être à
industries.
contrario donc plutôt
So
intérêt à les laisser
maybe
pour
it might be in
financer
my
le,
interest to
le
lower them
financement de la transition,
to
mais je peux aussi
facilitate
du coup
financing.
encourager les
And that
industries
might also
fossiles.
encourage
Donc on voit
fossil
que dans
fuel
ces
industries.
politiques,
So you
ce
can
qui est
see in
important,
these
c'est la
policies, what's
différenciation
important is the
sectorielle
differentiation
qui
by
doit être
sector,
prise en compte. Alors
which must be
l'option qui est
taken into
retenue
account. Now, the
par
option that's
certaines
been
banques
selected
centrales,
by
c'est le cas
some
de la
central
Banque
banks,
centrale européenne,
and this was the case of
c'est
the
d'agir
European
par
Central
la
Bank, is
politique
to
de
act
collatéral.
through
Et donc
collateral
l'idée, c'est
policy.
de mobiliser
You know, the idea is to mobilize
le collatéral qui est utilisé pour la
collateral
politique
used
monétaire en
for
lui
monetary
appliquant
policy
un
by applying
climate factor
a climate
qui
factor,
va lui-même prendre en compte le risque.
which will
Donc c'est
in
vraiment une
turn take
approche
account
toujours
of the
par les
risk.
risques.
The
C'est pas
approach is
une
still
approche
risk-based. It's not an
d'orientation
approach to
de
direct
l'investissement. Ça
investment.
m'amène à mon
This
troisième et
leads me to
dernier
my
point,
third and final
qui
point,
est le plus controversé, qui
which
est
is the most
le rôle de la
controversial,
Banque centrale
and
comme
that is the
investisseur. Donc,
role of the
je viens
central
de dire
bank as
qu'on
an investor.
utilisait
We
le climate factor
use the climate
pour des
factor
questions de
for
collatéral.
collateral issues,
Mais effectivement, la question, c'est de savoir
but in
si
fact,
l'action
the
de la
question
Banque
is to
centrale
see
doit
whether
porter sur
the action of the
l'intégralité de
central
son
bank should
portefeuille
apply to all of
ou
its
sur son portefeuille
portfolio
non
or
monétaire.
only its
Donc, en
non-monetary
Europe,
portfolio.
on
In
a des
Europe,
contraintes fortes qui
we
sont
have
liées au
strong
mandat
constraints to
de la
do
Banque
with our
centrale,
mandate, the mandate
et
of the
ça ne
central
porte
bank,
que sur le portefeuille
and
non
this concerns
monétaire,
only
c'est-à-dire les fonds propres de la Banque
non-monetary
centrale, ce
portfolios.
qu'elle
In other
utilise
words,
pour les fonds de
the money
réserve
it
de
uses
son
for its
personnel,
reserve
etc.
funds and for its
Là,
staff and
l'idée,
so on and
c'est
so forth. There, the idea
d'avoir un objectif
is to have
d'exemplarité, donc
an
en
objective to
publiant
set an
notamment
example
un
by
rapport
publishing,
d'investissement
in particular,
responsable,
a
etc.
responsible investment report,
Une des
and so on and
difficultés
so
en
forth.
Europe, c'est
One of the
qu'effectivement, il y a
difficulties in
plusieurs
Europe
clauses
is
à
that there are
respecter.
multiple
La
clauses that have
première,
to be
c'est
abided by.
le
The first
traité
being
sur l'Union européenne qui
is the European
impose
Union Treaty, which
d'agir
imposes
et de
an
soutenir les
action
politiques
and
économiques de
support
la Commission sans
for the
préjudice
Commission's
pour la
economic things
stabilité des
without
prix.
prejudice to
Et puis
the member
ensuite, il y
states'
a un
stability.
certain nombre de respects, notamment
And
le
then there's
respect de la
another
cohérence des
of
politiques publiques. Donc,
requirements to
c'est-à-dire qu'une banque
ensure
centrale, elle ne
public
doit pas faire la
consistency of
politique qui est
public
faite par
policy.
d'autres
It can't do
institutions.
its own
Il y a des
policy
principes
compared
de
to other institutions.
proportionnalité,
There's the
de
principle of
responsabilité
proportionality,
institutionnelle
of
et de
institutional
neutralité de la
responsibility,
politique
and
monétaire.
neutrality in monetary
Alors ça,
policy.
c'est le cas des banques européennes. Il
That's
y a
the
d'autres
case for
banques centrales
European
qui ont
banks. Other central
l'approche
banks
plus
have a more
interventionniste, comme je citais,
interventionist approach.
la
I can
Banque
mention
centrale de
the
Chine,
Central
par
Bank
exemple.
of China, for example.
Donc là, l'idée, c'est plutôt
And there, the
d'utiliser des
idea is
instruments
to
pour
use
orienter les flux
instruments
d'investissement.
to
Donc ça
direct
s'apparente un petit
investment
peu à de la
movements,
politique
and this
industrielle.
is more of an
Alors pour
industrial
conclure, je dirais que
policy.
le
So to
principal
conclude, I would say that the
défi dans
main
ce cas-là,
challenge
c'est
in this case
d'assurer
is to
d'être
ensure
cohérent avec le mandat qui est celui des banques
consistency
centrales,
with the mandate of the central bank,
de
to act
respecter la
and
responsabilité de
respect
l'institution et de maintenir à la
its
fois son
responsibility and
indépendance par
maintain
rapport au
one's
pouvoir public
independence
et in
in
fine
relation to
de
the
garantir
authorities,
de lutter contre le
and
financement monétaire. Donc c'est là
ultimately
où
prevent,
s'inscrivent les limites de l'action
in
des banques
fact,
centrales.
monetary policy
Voilà, je vous remercie
guarantees. So
pour votre
that's
attention
my.
et puis
Thank
je
you for
m'arrête
your
là
attention,
pour
and I'm going to stop here
cette
for the time
introduction.
being for this introductory comment.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Beaucoup. OK. Donc, merci beaucoup, Laurent. Donc, pour discuter
Thank you, Laurent. To discuss this issue, we are fortunate to have a panel, or high-level panel, with firstly two governors of Central African banks,
Yvon Sana-Bangui, qui est le
Yvon
gouverneur
Sana-Bangui, governor of the Central African States Bank, the BIAC,
Ivo
Andriana Rivello, governor of the Madagascar Central Bank,
nous avons Monsieur Raphaël Poignet, qui est le
and Mr. Raphaël Poignet, advisor to the representative of the European Central Bank to the Council of Prudential Supervision, so that's for the regulators. And finally, online, we have Mr. Amadou Sy, the Deputy Director for the Africa Division, tasked with regional studies. Thank you, Amadou, for being with us online and also for those being here on site. I'm going to suggest that we organize the discussion somewhat conversely to the plan followed by Laurent, and make the most of the fact of two governors of central banks and talk about monetary policy. As Laurent said, it is more controversial because there is an imperative mandate in regulation and price stability, and this may raise questions about its compatibility and alignment with that of measures against climate change. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over instantly to the governor of the BIAC about this.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Mr. Governor, gentlemen, dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and eminent guests participating online. I would like first to thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this webinar, which is being co-organized by FERDI and the Central Bank of France on a topic which, as we all know, is no longer an environmental concern, but it is really a question of survival for our economic, monetary, and financial survival. Now, the risks, as they were mentioned by the previous speakers, be they the physical risks or the risks connected with the transitioning, these risks are a direct threat to our capacity as central bankers to ensure the stability of prices and the robustness of our financial systems. And we know well that our role and mission as central bankers is to ensure this stability and this robustness of our financial systems. Now, I would like to address this topic of strategic importance, knowing that a central bank does not manage these issues directly, but it is our imperative duty to manage the financial consequences of such issues. And this is the action we need to take as central bankers and as supervisors for some of us, with CMAC, which covers 6 countries belonging to a shared monetary area with a banking supervisor called the Banking Commission of Central Africa. And I'm the governor and I'm the chair of this banking commission. So in this dual capacity, I take action on the subject of monetary policy as well as on the aspects of financial stability. So as I mentioned, CEMAC, which covers 6 countries, which are quite heterogeneous in their economies, in their infrastructures, and with respect to how each of these countries are located geographically, the way they are affected by climate change, and the consequences of climate-related issues should be appreciated according to these aspects. So the issue of climate change is of severe importance, knowing that the CEMAC area which is located in Central Africa, and it is the second green source for the planet. Knowing that our economies, because we're dealing with economic and financial aspects, our economies in this area are structurally vulnerable to physical shocks. So, let us here mention the recurring events of flooding, which have been destroying crops every year, with infrastructure being heavily impacted by these heavy events of flooding, which has contributed to reducing the supply and have generated an inflationary shock for food products. And with the community of Chad Lake countries, we know how impactful it is on food security for all the communities living off the water resources, needing water available for farming activities. So these phenomena have been affecting the equilibrium of our area, and it has exercised pressure on our foreign exchange currency reserves. For a number of years, importing food products have kept increasing in the way of their prices in this area, and climate-related issues in this second source of green resources for the planet is a factor of macroeconomic instability. So in the face of all these issues, what should be the role of the central bank of Central African countries? Well, its key and critical role should be to innovate within an operating framework that is first and foremost to strengthen the range of analytics tools and instruments which are key to apprehend and review those extreme climate shocks which are specific to our sub-region, incorporating them into our models of quarterly planning and forecasting. This would enable us to anticipate the way these risks impact growth, inflation levels, and public debt levels. So the second action, which central bankers take, is a major innovation. It is on the monetary front. We have been working to revamp our operating framework in order to better direct and channel the financial flows to fund the transition. Our goal is to revive the so-called B pillar of the monetary policy. This pillar used to aim at funding medium to long-term economic projects. Well, we are on the verge of structurally revamping this pillar into a green pillar for refinancing activities and projects. And the key part in this mechanism will be the mechanisms to discount the assets part of this refinancing scheme. In other simpler words, the banking loans funding low carbon or adaptation projects which will be deemed eligible as being more resilient will be granted more favorable discounts. This is an incentive, and this is a direct way to utilize our balance sheet as an incentive mechanism to redirect credit flows into more sustainable sectors of our economies. These are a few examples of the initiatives which are underway and currently being developed and implemented as part of a number of working groups I have set up to review jointly with all stakeholders how we should be transforming the pillar to finance and refinance transition, including all these shock scenarios related to climate change, which have to be taken into consideration, which are specific to our African sub-region. So the idea is not to replicate or copy, but to adapt those instruments already in existence and available to our macroeconomic models and to fuel this transition. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Governor. You have highlighted the two specific features of African economies which have made it difficult to combat climate change and adaptation of monetary policy among one. The first is that it is important that the supply shocks have a key impact on inflation and weigh down on the price basket. So the risks that Laurent Clair are all the heavier. And the second is the high cost of capital, which makes energy transitioning more complicated, more costly. So it is more difficult to reclaim the $1.3 trillion which are required to fund energy transition and the combat against climate change, more generally speaking, in Africa. Mr. Governor of the Central Bank of Madagascar, you are confronted with the change challenge. How are you addressing these challenges by way of your monetary policy? Well, for Madagascar, we have no longer to demonstrate how heavily we are exposed to climate change. Madagascar has been classified 162 among the 182 countries which are heavily exposed and heavily vulnerable to climate change. Now, climate change is a recent notion, though. Yet, the International Monetary Fund has been considering this notion as a micro-critical issue, and everybody started addressing this issue and trying to remedy it. One of the first actions we took was to first develop a taxonomy, because everybody would agree that a type of investment or a type of asset will be subject to climate change and the associated risk. But we all need to agree about what is meant by green and greening, quote unquote. As was said, a committee was set up, a working group or a think tank was set up, as the governor just said, whose task is to get better informed and understand better the risk of climate change intersecting with monetary policy, with capacity building in development areas, with a few lessons which have been drawn. Number one, we need to avoid all types of greenwashing, i.e., what is green is not always climate related, and what is climate related should not necessarily all be green, because the drought, which takes red colors in Madagascar because we are affected by cyclones and hurricanes in Madagascar. But in the south of the Madagascar island, we are confronted with droughts. So we need to confront these two issues, and we need to adapt our monetary policies to address these two issues. So not to consider climate change as part of monetary policy would be a mistake, because it is an important factor. And we need to say something, i.e., in Madagascar, every time a hurricane hits the island or a natural disaster hits our islands, our GDP is immediately affected by 1 to 4%, which is gigantic as an impact on the policy of the state. And of course, the Central Bank of Madagascar is at the midst of all these issues in order to provide responses and solutions. Now, what are the avenues for development which will be implemented by the Central Bank of Madagascar? Among these avenues for solutions, you have the QPM, which really is a quarterly assessment of our statistics and our parameters, with another indicator, which is climate change. Now, next to this, there's a need for us to get used to implementing collaterals, enabling the primary banking sector to finance green initiatives in Madagascar. The central bank, by essence, is the last resort lender. So it is not up to the central bank to lend money, but it is up to the central bank to set up the appropriate guarantee systems in order to create the appropriate collaterals, enabling the primary banks to finance and fund green economy projects. There's an initiative that we took. In fact, there were two such initiatives that were taken, which were the issuance of green bonds, and two banks started to do this. They raised some $70 million on the back of these green bonds with the help of the French development agency AFD to support businesses and green projects and initiatives. And the Central Bank of Madagascar has tried to help them by way of banking supervision to check that the funds which were raised are duly invested into and channeled into the targeted initiatives and projects. Now, is this enough? The answer is obviously no. We are only at the beginning of the process, and we are engaged in a process, and by being engaged in such a process, we always try and improve our tools, our instruments, and our set of metrics and indicators so that we can determine and even anticipate the negative effect of climate change. And in this respect, we are taking action day in and day out. And also, this involves raising awareness of people by way of communication, by way of our monetary policy. And what was said earlier is true. Due to our role, missions, and mandates, the central bankers are to ensure price, financial stability, managing the instruments applicable to credit, but we shouldn't content ourselves and stay limited with our conventional activities of central bankers. We need to reach out to find new tools, new economic platforms, and even, I would say, come up with an economic framework which would incorporate in the way we go about doing things, in the way we think through, should incorporate climate change as an indicator. But the process is just as its beginning. And I find that this type of webinar with the other colleagues and counterparts will help us improve things faster and further. Thank you, Governor. I would like now to give the floor to Amadou Sy so that we get his opinion and the opinion of the International Monetary Fund, which is an institution which analyzed and interpreted its role and mandate by creating the Resilience and Sustainability Trust to adapt its role to the climate change, which in a way is the IMF response to the tragedy of the horizon, because the IMF usually funds emergency relief and disasters. It will be now funding energy transitioning and combat against climate change over the long term. Now, Amadou Sy, what is your take and how do you respond to these words by the two governors from the IMF? Well, yes, thank you. Let me take advantage of this opportunity to thank FERDI, Banque de France, and the French AFD for inviting me to speak here at this seminar. Unfortunately, I will probably be repeating some of the things which have already been said, but at the IMF overall, we have three areas of action with respect to the response to climate change on African economies. The first is our supervisory role, which involves discussing with the central banks on their respective monetary policies. The second area of action relates to our program, which is the financial sector assessment programs, which are to assess the financial systems, which has us develop scenarios, conducting stress tests. And of course, this is done jointly with the supervisors. And the third area of action is the facility you've just mentioned, the Resilience and Sustainability Facility, and which has us grant long-term loans to countries which are eligible, of course, which are confronted to these climate-related challenges.
So perhaps for the first activity of surveillance, I believe that other speakers have already addressed this. It's fairly complex for a central bank to manage the impact of a climate shock. You have to look at the size, type, and the effects of this crisis in the balance between supply and demand. And as we said before, its persistence before we decide on an answer. And we also have this need to develop new approaches to modeling. There are physical risks in Africa, such as drought for agriculture, drought that impacts in agriculture, for example, cyclones, then can impact the capital stock. There's also channels for transmission. If banks have problems to increasing credit risks or failed assets, that will make other channels more fragile. And as we've said before, attenuation or adaptation policies that are deliberate but may be a source of inflation. But if we look at the continent, there are one or two specific features to Africa and paradoxes, specific features for the region, but also a heterogeneity between countries. Countries are very different. The continent is more exposed to climate crises, firstly. Secondly, the price of foodstuffs is a main source of inflation, 45% in countries with low income compared to 25% for emerging nations and 15% in the most developed countries. Thirdly, the impact of climate crises such as droughts and floods have an instant effect on food production. And finally, on a social level, agriculture is very important for employment and above all for the more vulnerable strata of society. There are other specific features to Africa. A lot of African countries, for example, depend enormously on on the export of fossil fuel energy. It's more than 90% in Angola of exports. Some countries are making new discoveries of fossil fuels, such as Mozambique, for example. Another specific feature is, in English, the sovereign bank nexus. The proportion of sovereign assets in portfolios of African banks is the highest worldwide. And finally, as you also emphasized, the cost of capital is very high. Even without looking at the climate aspects, the nominal interest rates remain high in the region, even though median inflation has fallen to pre-COVID levels. We still have 20% of countries that have inflation at levels that exceed the pre-COVID levels. Basically, not all these climate crises had the same impact on inflation. Some studies, for example, indicated that droughts will increase inflation far more than flooding. I didn't even know, though, for example, in Madagascar, there were both types occurring at the same time. And finally, there's this cascading effect or domino effect. If I look at the case of Zambia, that had a lot of droughts, that had a farming sector that was particularly impacted, is also dependent on hydroelectric energy. So there is an effect on supply, or electricity supply, because the basins, the dams, were unable to generate enough energy. So there was a domino effect on the entire economy, or the economy as a whole. All of this is to say that the task of the two governors is extremely difficult one. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Amadouci, for this very transversal view. Before we conclude on this part of the discussion about monetary policy, I want to go back to Laurent Clerc, if he is willing, and ask a trick question. The mandate, the monetary mandate of central banks or multinational banks in the event of monetary unions to attenuate climate change, it's a global requirement. But somewhere, major central banks with control over the currencies may have a responsibility that transcends their frontiers. For example, if you have to facilitate a long-term trajectory of the energy transition with a cost of capital that is lower, then it has to be done not only in one's own region, but also in the rest of the world. How is this subject seen? Now, I see it's easier for stability, but for monetary policy, I wanted to ask you. Well, in principle, there's no coordination of multilateral decisions or global decisions in the level of interest rates, because that will depend, obviously, on the level of exposure of each economy. The point that you're raising is not really directly addressed by central banks in the monetary policy aspects. But behind this, in this question, is the cost of financing. There are financing conditions that are determined on a global level. There are economies that are advanced, that set the level of interest rates, so to speak. But after that, on a national level or domestic level, is the risk premium addition, which will depend both on the economic policy and shocks that are specific. And you can see this. Mr. Stee said this. What we're starting to see today is because states are directly exposed to specific risks, this is reflected in the risk premiums. We've seen this, the dependency on agricultural or oil income, which is particularly vulnerable, and that will impact production, the tax balance, and will be reflected in financing conditions that are already differentiated with higher premiums,
Bien
risk
sûr,
premiums.
on peut faire
Now, of
baisser tout
course,
ça,
we
mais ça
can
ne
lower
change
all
pas
this,
que
but
le
it won't
risque
change the fact
climatique,
that
c'est
climate
effectivement
risks
quelque chose de global, mais
are
sa caractéristique,
something,
c'est
a
d'être très
global factor,
fortement
but its
asymétrique.
characteristic is
Et
that it's
chaque
highly
pays est exposé
asymmetrical,
de façon un petit
and
peu
each
différente.
country
Il y a
is
des zones qui
exposed
sont beaucoup
slightly
plus que
differently.
d'autres.
Some are far more
Et
than
voilà, il n'y a
others.
pas vraiment de coordination
There's no real
des modalités de
coordination
fixation des taux
in the
d'intérêt
conditions for
des banques
setting
centrales au
interest
niveau
rates
international.
among international central banks.
Merci Laurent. Et donc,
Thank you,
le temps
Laurent.
est venu du
Time
de
has
la
come
deuxième
now
partie de la
for the
discussion.
second
Donc,
part of the
je vais
discussion.
laisser Monsieur Raphaël Poignet
I'll
lancer
let
cette discussion
Mr.
sur
Raphaël Poignet
les questions
launch the
de
discussion on
stabilité
the issue
financière
of financial
et
stability
de changement climatique et de
and
lutte
climate
contre le
change
changement climatique aussi.
and fight measures
Merci
against climate
beaucoup,
change as well.
Monsieur Cabriac. Et
Thank you, Mr.
à
Cabriac.
titre personnel, je suis tout à fait
And
honoré
on a
d'avoir la
personal
possibilité
level, I'm very honored
d'échanger, de
to have
partager
the possibility of
les
discussing
différentes
and
initiatives
sharing
qu'a pu
the
prendre
various
la Banque
initiatives
centrale
taken
européenne
by the
en
European Central
matière
Bank
de risques
in terms
climatiques ces
of
dernières
climate
années.
risks in
C'est
recent
vrai que la
years.
Banque centrale
Now,
européenne
it's
n'a
true,
que
the European
26
Central Bank is
ans
only 26 years old,
d'existence, donc même si nous avons commencé à
and
travailler sur
even
le
though
sujet il y a
we
6 ans,
started
ça fait quand
to
même sur
look
ces
at this
26 ans
after
quand
about
même
6 months,
un
out
certain
of
nombre de temps,
26,
donc c'est pour ça que je dirais
it's
pas que
quite a lot of
c'est
time. I won't say
si récent que ça.
that it's
Alors,
that
pour
recent
être
after
clair, moi,
all.
je
Now,
travaille
to
du
be
côté
clear, I work
de
on
la micro-supervision, donc de la
micro
supervision
supervision, so
bancaire. La
supervision
BCE
of
supervise les
banks. The
113 plus grandes
ECB
banques
looks at the
de la zone euro.
113
Donc, je vais
biggest banks in the
surtout
Eurozone. I
parler
will
de ce que nous
be
faisons
talking above all
à ce
about what we
titre.
do
Et ce
on
que je
this
voudrais
level.
commencer à faire, c'est
And I would like
parler
to
de
start to do is
l'aspect
to
donc
start to talk
légitimité
about
de notre
the
action.
legitimacy
Alors,
aspects of
Laurent
our
Claire,
actions.
oui, monsieur
Laurent Claire,
tu as très bien expliqué,
you very clearly
c'est
explained
peut-être
it.
un sujet qui
It's maybe a subject
qui fait lieu à moins de controverses.
that is less
Cependant,
controversial.
il est important de
With
rappeler
that
pourquoi
said,
est-ce
it's
que c'est
important
dans
to remember
notre
why
mandat.
it's within our mandate.
Notre mandat,
Our
effectivement,
mandate
c'est la stabilité financière,
is
c'est la
financial
gestion des
stability,
risques. Nous
risk
sommes en
management.
charge,
We are tasked with,
comme je le disais,
as I
de
said,
nous assurer que les grandes banques
ensuring that
restent
the leading
solides
banks remain
et qu'elles
solid
puissent gérer le
and
risque
that they can
matériel. Alors,
manage
ce
their
concept de
material
risque
risks.
matériel,
This concept of
il est très bien
material risk
explicité
is very
dans
clearly
les textes
explained
prudentiels
in the
qui
prudential
fondent
statutes
notre approche,
that are
ainsi
the
que dans
basis of
les
our
principaux
approach
textes du comité de
and
Bâle.
in the main
Donc,
statutes of the
c'était
Basel
notre point de
Committee.
départ en fait quand on a
That was our
commencé à
starting
travailler
point
sur ce
when we
sujet
started
en
to work
2019.
on these issues in
Nous
2019.
considérons
We
que
consider
le risque
that
climatique
the climate risk
matériel,
and
donc
material
à ce
risk
titre, les banques
and
se doivent
therefore
de
banks
gérer ce risque en fonction
must manage
justement
this risk in
de
light
cette
of that
matérialité. Ce qui me permet aussi d'ajouter un
materiality,
élément, c'est
which means I can
qu'aujourd'hui,
add
nous parlons
something
principalement de
to
risque
talking
climatique.
today
Du
about
côté de
climate
la
risks
BCE,
primarily, but from the
assez
ECB
tôt,
side,
nous sommes aussi penchés sur les risques
fairly
de
soon
nature.
we started
Donc, ce n'est
looking
pas un
at
sujet de mon propos
natural
ici,
risks as well. So that's
mais
not
évidemment sous le
within the
contrôle de
permit
messieurs les
remit
gouverneurs,
here, but if
ce sont
the
aussi
governors will allow me,
des risques
these
donc,
are
qui peuvent
also risks
affecter certaines
that
économies,
may
notamment
impact some
particulièrement
economies,
exposées
in particular
à la
those that
pêche,
are
à
particularly
l'agriculture,
exposed to
ou même d'un
fishing,
point de vue
agriculture,
extrêmement de
even from
transition
the
sur
time
les
in
sujets
terms of
de bois rares,
non-transition, in terms
de bois
of
précieux. Donc c'est aussi,
precious woods
un sujet
and
que nous regardons en complément
rare
du risque,
materials as well.
du
So this is
risque, des
something we
risques
look in
physiques et de
addition to
transition
the
d'un point de vue
physical
climatique.
and
Donc,
transition risks
je
for
parlais
the
de
climate.
cette
I was talking
légitimité que
about
nous avons, que
that
nous considérons
legitimacy that we have, that we
par le
consider
biais du risque. Et
through
d'ailleurs,
the
ça a été
prism of
l'approche
risks.
générale de la Banque
That
centrale
was the general
européenne,
approach
de
of
prendre
the
systématiquement
European Central
ce
Bank to
sujet,
systematically
non
look at
pas
this
évidemment d'un point de
issue,
vue politique,
not
parce
from a
qu'on dit toujours
political
que nous ne
or
sommes
policy
pas
point of view.
policy makers, nous sommes
We're not
policy
policy
takers.
makers, we are
Donc,
policy
nous n'avons
takers.
pas de mandat politique,
We have no
ni
policy
même d'écriture de la
mandate
réglementation
even to write
en
regulations in
matière de
terms
climat.
of
Cependant,
the climate.
du
With
fait
that
de
said,
notre mandat
given our
de
mandate
gestion des risques,
as a
nous
risk
approchons
manager,
nous
that
discutons avec les banques de ces sujets.
we discuss
Alors,
with
pour être
banks
un petit peu
about
plus
these issues.
concret,
To be a
qu'est-ce
bit
que
more
nous
specific,
demandons aux
more
banques
concrete,
sous notre
what we ask
supervision? Alors,
banks
il
under our
existe
supervision to
maintenant
do,
de nombreux
there are
textes
now
à ce
multiple
sujet,
statutes
notamment
about
depuis la
this,
publication en
in particular
2022
since the publication in
des
2022
principes de
of
gestion
principles
des risques
for
climatiques
climate
par
risk management
le comité de Bâle,
by the Basel
enrichi
Committee,
également en
enhanced
2024
in
par la
2024
publication
with the
des
publication
principes fondamentaux du
of the
comité de Bâle
fundamental
qui
principles of the
couvrent très
Basel
bien les risques
principle that cover
climatiques. Alors, je ne vais pas
the
exposer
climate
tout ce
risks.
qu'on demande aux
I
banques.
won't explain
Je suis sûr
everything
qu'il y a
we
une
do.
liste assez
There's a
longue.
very
J'ai
long
entendu
list
certaines se
that I
plaindre
can assure you. I've heard
à
some
ce
complain
sujet.
about that.
On va dire, on peut les catégoriser
We
de
can
la manière
categorize
suivante.
these as
Alors,
follows.
ce qu'on demande aux banques,
What we ask banks to
c'est
do
d'abord de gérer
is
le risque
firstly to
climatique
manage
d'un point de vue
climate
de la
risks
gouvernance et de la
from
stratégie.
a point of view
Et
of
je pense que c'est
governance
un
and
point de
strategy.
départ extrêmement
That's a
important,
starting point that
dans
is
la
very
mesure où
important,
ce
I
qu'on a
believe,
observé, c'est qu'à
insofar
partir
as
du
what
moment
we've
où,
observed
dans
is
les
that
conseils
where we
d'administration des
see
banques, il y
in
a une vraie
boards of
prise de conscience de la matérialité du risque,
there's
en
awareness
fait, c'est ce qui
of
va
the
déclencher
materiality of
au
these
sein de
risks,
chaque banque, donc
what
vraiment d'un point de
will
vue micro,
trigger for in each bank
une prise en compte d'un point de vue risque
a
dans les
consideration
différentes
of the
équipes au
risk
moment
in
notamment de
various
l'octroi des
teams,
crédits,
especially in
du
production and
risque
credit,
climatique.
in
Donc
terms of
ce
climate
que nous
risks.
demandons aux banques, et nous
What
nous
we ask
assurons que
banks
c'est toujours
and what we
fait,
ensure is always
c'est
done
que par
is
exemple une personne au sein
that,
du
for
conseil d'administration
example,
soit
one
un peu plus
person within the board
spécialisée
of
sur ces
directors should be
sujets
specialized
et
about
sponsorise entre
in
guillemets
these
toutes les
subjects and would
initiatives dans la
sponsor
banque
all the
sur la
initiatives
gestion
in
des
the
risques
bank
climatiques.
in
Il y a
the
également, j'ai
management
parlé
of
de la
climate risks.
stratégie.
I've also
Alors,
talked about
monsieur le
strategy.
gouverneur, vous l'avez très bien expliqué, comment
Gentlemen,
est-ce que
governors,
justement ce
you very
risque
clearly
affecte
explained how this
certaines
risk
économies. Alors
impacts
effectivement, c'est de
specific
très manière
economies.
hétérogène, mais de
This
notre
is it's
expérience,
heterogeneous, but in
les
our
113
experience,
plus grandes banques que nous
the 113
supervisons
biggest banks that we
sont
supervise
toutes plus ou moins
are
exposées, alors de
all
manière
more or less
différente,
exposed
aux
in
risques
different ways
climatiques et de nature.
to climate
Donc quand je
risks
parlais
and
de la
natural risks.
stratégie, il s'agit
And when I was talking about
de
strategy,
mener une
I meant
réflexion au niveau des conseils
thinking
d'administration
about at the level of the
et du
board
senior management de chaque
and
banque en
for the
disant
senior management of
est-ce
each
que je
bank
dois adapter
by saying, should I adapt
ma stratégie? Est-ce que je dois
my
ajuster
strategy?
mes
Should I
limites de
adjust
risque
my risk
justement
limits
pour prendre en compte
to take account
l'évolution, non
of
pas seulement à court terme, mais à
developments,
moyen
not
et à
over the
long
short,
terme,
but
de
also in the medium
l'environnement
and long
climatique dans
terms
lequel je me trouve.
of
Nous
the
avons des
environment in
banques
which
en
I find
Europe qui sont
myself. We
extrêmement
have banks in
exposées
Europe that are extremely exposed
à l'agriculture, par exemple,
to
dans
farming,
certaines
for
régions
example,
du
in
sud
some
de l'Europe
regions
qui
in
seront
southern
particulièrement
Europe
affectées,
that
qui
are
commencent déjà à être
particularly
particulièrement affectées
affected
dans les prochaines années.
and will be so in
Donc,
the years to
est-ce
come.
que j'ajuste ma stratégie,
Do I
etc.
adjust therefore my
Bon,
strategy
je
and
le
so on?
répète encore une fois, ce n'est
So
pas
I
à la
ought to
BCE
repeat
de
this.
dire
It's
à
not
chaque
up to the
banque
ECB to
où est-ce
tell
que vous
each
allez
bank
aller. C'est
where are
pas
you
la
going.
BCE qui dit au conseil
The
d'administration
ECB
maintenant vous
doesn't
allez
say to a
là ou
board of
là.
directors, you're
Ça,
going in this
c'est évidemment
direction
c'est hors
or
de
another
question. Je le
direction.
disais,
That
ça
is
c'est
out
une
of the
policy
question.
taker.
We
Par
are
contre, ce que nous
policy
demandons, c'est qu'il y ait
takers.
cette réflexion
But
et que
what we
cette
want
réflexion
is to have
ait
that
lieu
reflection, that
sur la
thinking to
base
occur on the basis
d'analyses structurées.
of
Alors, les analyses
structured
structurées, on aura peut-être
analyses.
l'occasion d'en
Now,
reparler.
we'll talk about
Évidemment,
this
il y a les
perhaps.
stress tests, les
There are
analyses de
stress tests,
scénarios.
there are
Il
scenario
existe en
analyses.
2025
There is,
même
in
énormément
2025,
d'études et de
a lot of
méthodologies
studies and
justement pour se faire
methodologies
une idée de
to
quels sont
have
en
an
tant que
idea
banque
what,
mes risques matériels,
as
quels
a
sont les
bank,
canaux
are
de
my material
transmission
risks and what are
des
the
risques
channels for
physiques
transmission of
et de
physical risks
transition
and
dans les
transition
risques que porte ma
in
banque.
the risks
On
that my
pense
bank
évidemment
incurs.
traditionnellement
We're
au
thinking
risque de
traditionally, of
crédit,
course, of credit
mais
risks,
il est clair aussi que ce
but it's
sont les
clear
risques
also
opérationnels des
that
banques
there
qui
are
vont être
operating
affectés,
risks for
les
banks that will
data
be
centers,
impacted,
ce genre de choses.
data centers and
Risques de
so on and
marché, il y
so
a aussi de
forth.
nombreuses études
Market
sur la
risks, there are a
matérialité
lot
du
of
risque,
studies on the
également de
materiality of risks,
transition sur les risques de marché,
particularly the
potentiellement de
transition
liquidité,
for
etc.,
market risk,
etc.
liquidity
Donc, ce que
risks,
nous
what have
attendons,
you. And
c'est
so
une
what
réflexion
we
de la
expect,
banque à ce
therefore, is
sujet.
thinking by
Et
the
le
bank about
deuxième
this.
grand bloc, entre guillemets,
The
d'attente
second large
potentielle,
block of prudential
j'ai déjà
expectations,
nommé la gouvernance
I
et la
mentioned
stratégie,
governance and
c'est donc la
strategy,
gestion des risques
is
au plus
therefore
général. Donc ici, ce qu'on
risk
demande, c'est un
management
niveau un
on
petit
a
peu plus
broader
micro
scale.
dans chaque banque,
What we're
de
doing is
dire,
on a
OK,
micro level, and each bank
est-ce que
can
vous
say,
êtes assuré
okay,
au moment de
are you
l'octroi du crédit
insured
d'avoir demandé
when
toutes les
have you
informations
ensured that when you
nécessaires
grant a loan
à la
that you have
contrepartie, à
all
vos
the
clients?
information for your clients
Traditionnellement,
or your
bon, il y avait
counterparts?
un collatéral,
Traditionally,
il y avait un
there was
collatéral,
collateral,
on avait une évaluation
there
externe,
was
c'est très
an
clair.
external
Maintenant, il faut aller
evaluation. That's great. Now we
un
have to
cran
go
plus loin. Si
a
on a la
little further
possibilité,
and
est-ce qu'on peut
say,
avoir
if we
d'autres
can,
données
can we have
sur
more data
le degré d'isolation,
about the
sur la
degree of
localisation
insulation, of the
géographique précise
location, the
du
specific
collatéral
location
quand
of the collateral?
on prête à une grande entreprise? Est-ce qu'on
When
sait
you're lending
exactement où
to
se
a
trouve
large
le collatéral,
corporation, do
surtout
we know
s'il est
exactly where
exposé
the collateral
dans des
is,
régions géographiques
especially if it's
exposées,
exposed
etc.,
in an
etc. Donc,
exposed
c'est ce que je demande.
regions,
Et après, il y a un
and
dernier
so on
point
and
que
so forth?
je
And there's a final
soulignerai,
point that I'd like to
qu'on demande
emphasize
aussi aux
that we
banques,
ask
mais que je trouve
banks,
particulièrement
which I
important,
find
c'est la
particularly important,
transparence.
is
Alors la
transparency.
transparence, c'est
Transparency
assez intéressant parce que je trouve
is quite
que
interesting
sur le
because
sujet climatique,
in terms of the
c'était un des
climate,
éléments qui ont
it's one
précédé,
of the
entre guillemets,
factors
une
that
prise de conscience
preceded
plus
a
générale,
more
notamment
general awareness
du TCFD
with the emergence of the TCFD in
de
2017.
publier dans leur
We asked
rapport
banks, therefore, in their extra
des
financial
éléments liés à
reports,
leurs risques,
factors relating to their risks,
risques de physique et de
for the
transition.
physical risks and
Donc
transition
les
risks.
émissions financées,
So
etc.
emissions that are
Sans aller
financed
trop
and so
dans les
on and so
détails,
forth. Without going into
néanmoins,
too many
pour
details,
donner aux
but
investisseurs
at least we can
externes
give
une
external
vision un peu plus
investors
précise
a
de leur
more
niveau de
accurate
risque, ce qui
vision
est
of their
effectivement
risk risk level, which is always necessary to calibrate the cost of their capital. So it's a long shopping list. As I said, we've been working on this for several years. We don't expect banks to do this all very quickly, but it is part of our action plan and will continue to be so at the present. Thank you. Thank you, Raphael. You highlighted the huge role, the role of creating standards. Mr. Governor, you've also mentioned this very important point in terms of financial stability to create standards that take account of climate risks. Where are you for the BIAC?
Bien, donc, ayant rappelé
having
tout à l'heure que
pointed out
les
earlier
risques climatiques, qu'ils soient physiques
climate risks, be they physical or transitional, have an impact on price stability and the solidity of the financial system. So the question of inflation is dealt with in terms of monetary policy and in particular transmission of monetary policy instruments. Now, what is the issue for financial stability? We have to say that the central bank is the supervisor and must implement actions
en synergie,
in synergy as a supervisor. The COBAC, our first banking commission, we developed a strategic plan for 2025 to 2029 that already integrates a prudential framework that takes account of climate risks.
Just to say that this prudential framework will at some point be upgraded, but today it takes into consideration the credit risk, the market risks, the operating risks, and the criticality risks. And in the CEMAC area, which covers 6 countries, we have 55 banks, 49 of which comply with the supervisory and prudential ratios. We believe today that the work towards the response to climate change will involve setting up stress test mechanism focusing on the climate change. The idea will not to be to replicate, as I said, or to reproduce these instruments, but to adapt these tools and instruments to the specific features and needs of our sub-region, with 6 countries having totally different economic levels, with very different exposures, yet very high exposures to sovereign risks. So it is of great importance in the CEMAC zone that we take into consideration these climate-related risks in our prudential ratios. And this will enable us to transition and provide the right level of support to commercial banks to identify and assess these climate-related risks, helping them in optimizing the way they review the credit risks. The goal being to make the sub-regional banking system more resilient over the medium and long term, knowing that this system is very much vulnerable to credit risks, and this vulnerability is very specific to this sub-region, and I mentioned the agricultural shocks which are affected by climate change, and also the transitional risks connected with the collapse of the oil-related income, knowing that it has affected the balance, the economic balance of the state. So all these aspects are being taken into consideration in our strategic plan, and the successful integration of climate-related issues will involve two very critical actions, because they are a priority of our strategic plan. Here, I'm talking about international cooperation. Among one, we are striving for increased synergy across and with all the other supervisors. If there is one area where we want to strengthen things, is with respect to collaboration, cooperation, sharing and exchanging, training, expertise, best practice, and Banque de France already has been leading the way with such an initiative, as you were the first central bank to implement a climate-related stress test model. The other central banks contributed to dovetailing the models to make them more specific to our environment. And this should be the way ahead, which will enable us to address and onboard this context of climate risks due to its high degree of complexity, very complex to identify these risks and to collect the data related with these risks. So in order to successfully integrate this data, as I mentioned, number one is international cooperation. Number two is even more important, which is the human capital. We need to build capacity and strengthen the ability by our agents and our experts to address climate changes by elevating their technical and technological expertise in a synergistic manner, jointly with central banks, with the international monetary funds, as well as other technical providers. We can, by doing so, meet the challenges ahead. So much for what I could share with you. And by way of conclusion, I would say that combating climate change will only succeed if the financial services sector is involved. It is important to understand that, knowing that the financial services sector will never be stable if the regulators do not stand firm in the actions they take. And as central bankers and the Banking Commission, all the bodies in Central Africa, we want to successfully implement this work stream, knowing that if we travel alone, it will be long and tedious traveling, but if we travel together, it will be faster and more effective. So our work in this area is of great importance. It is important that we act responsibly and we act boldly in order to provide a future which is stable, a future which is sustainable for the communities in the economic and monetary community of the Central African states, knowing that this combat, this fight against climate change will ensure the prosperity of human beings. Human beings are the very center of all these strategies, all this planning, all this anticipation work. Thank you very much. Thank you, Governor. You said that Madagascar was one of the most exposed countries to the physical climate-related risks. Now, are banks prepared and ready to assess and measure these risks and take them on board? Otherwise, what do the central bank and the regulators to incentivize them, to push them into doing that? Well, indeed, let me share 3 points here. The first is that Madagascar has benefited from the IMF program on the resilience and the sustainability fund, just to show that we are at the heart of climate change and we are very much affected by the physical risks associated with climate change. With the Stability and Sustainability Fund, the goal is to adopt a national strategy on climate change. Now, with such a strategy on board, the role of the central bank will be to collect data and information of economic nature, knowing that we have readjusted our mechanisms. The Supervision Commission and the Central Bank should really onboard greener agendas in order to issue guidelines and directions which are green. And with the Supervision Commission, some banks have already adopted green finance instruments and processes to ensure greener sources of energy and greener farming activities with respect to equipment, technical solutions, and farming activities and operations. This was the first point. The second point is that green financial inclusion should be strengthened. Traceability, openness, and transparency of green financing should be strengthened and improved, and more capital should be mobilized. There is a huge lack and shortage of capital when it is a question of financing farmers or green sources of energy, anything connected with green. We speak a lot about green bonds in the international arena, but a country like Madagascar, with its difficulty and with its level of exposure, has not been benefiting from these green bonds and these green instruments. Yet, in our initiatives with the banking industry, we are providing incentives to transition. Another area is insurance. By definition, insurance companies in Madagascar are being supervised by the Prudential Committee or Prudential Commission. And basically, insurance companies provide coverage to everything apart from act of God. So anything associated with climate change is typically and historically considered as being act of God. But in Madagascar, the insurance companies have implemented what we call d'initial insurance coverage. This is a project which was jointly set up with the GIZ, Prada, and the Logiciel insurance coverage was provided jointly with the World Food Programme. The idea was to combat drought. Insurance companies have been ensuring that farmers would be covered if rainfall was insufficient for them to cultivate their crops. So insurance coverage is about risk taking and anticipating future long-term risks. But based on these insurance coverage programs, 8,000 farmers took out an insurance policy. Yet, if disaster struck, then their insurance policy would compensate them for the lost crops and the lost revenues. And it has been very successful. This is the type of initiatives that, as central bankers and supervisors of the banking industry, have been guiding and supporting, so that there is as little misunderstanding between the insurance companies and between the insured parties. In this respect, this is what we do as part of our strategy to make things better. Of course, we need data, and this is why we are always trying to improve the data which we collect from the primary banks and ask them to strengthen and improve their reporting system so that we get reliable data, so that we can continually adapt this policy to combat climate change. This is what I wanted to share. I wanted to be short, to transmit the key takeaway messages, i.e. the role taken by central banks on climate change. Thank you. Thank you very much. I will let Amadou Sy respond, but I would like to ask a specific question to Amadou Sy, because Amadou Sy and the governor of the Bank of Central African States mentioned how important it is, this transitioning risk of countries which are importers and exporters of oil, which are systemic risks because the states draw most of their financial resources from importing and exporting oil, and the countries live off oil, and exposure to fossil fuel has been gigantic in those countries now. How has the International Monetary Fund been addressing this risk above and beyond what it usually does by addressing the risk of volatile fluctuations of fossil fuel prices? Well, this question is very relevant and goes beyond the climate issues. A country which I know well because I worked 3 years on it is Angola. Well, every year, the recommendation was that the Angolese government was to diversify the structure of its economy, because, as I said, more than 90% of exports and a large part of the tax income and currency income originated in oil. So, which is a very big risk above and beyond the climate issues. Now, having said that, Angola is a country which has been trying to diversify its energy mix as much as possible, of course. And this is just an aside, but some oil companies, especially European oil companies, have been more and more engaging in the generation of renewable energy like solar power or wind power. So this effort to diversify their operations, activities, and economies, and diversifying the energy mix is a must to do. And Angola, like the other countries, have to go and do this. Now, coming back to financial stability, which you mentioned, I would like to make 3 points here. And I will mention some of the specific African features of the financial system. Then I can speak about the financial sector assessment program. And then in a third point, I would like to mention the facility for resilience and stability. Or resilience and stability facility. Now, with respect to the specific feature of African regions, I would like to say that yesterday and the day before yesterday's discussion were of very high quality, when the director of the Central Bank of Rwanda emphasized the importance of official development banks, which play a key role in the green transitioning. And she spoke about the role of the central bank. And I believe that in Rwanda, the central bank is the authority for supervising the Rwandan Development Bank. And this is of importance and of interest when you look at the role to be played by central banks. In those countries where central banks play these roles as supervisors and regulators of development banks, these aspects should be onboarded more and further. Now, also yesterday, the gentleman from the Moroccan Central Bank mentioned that a directive that is applicable in Morocco, that the subsidiaries of Moroccan-based companies have to apply the same standards and rules. For example, the way the climate-related risks are calculated. And it is of importance because we can see that there is a growing role of Pan-African banks, including Moroccan banks or Nigerian banks. I even saw a Tanzanian bank which has been operating in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Kinshasa. So you can see that there are cross-border supervisory aspects and issues which have taken on in importance. And the governor of the Bank of Central African States mentioned that the sharing of information, the sharing of expertise has become even more important. Now, with respect to our financial sector assessment program, I believe that Morocco will be benefiting from it next year, if I'm not mistaken. I know that there is also such program being active in Angola. So there's a micro level and a macro level. At the macro approach level, qualitative assessments are being conducted, climate-related scenarios are being developed, and risks are being analyzed based on stress tests. I can give you the example of South Africa, where we looked at physical risks like drought and others, and we also looked at those risks related with transitioning, with the increase of the price of carbon. But we try and add this up with a micro approach, like the colleague of the European Central Bank just mentioned, with by looking at the effects on businesses, on households, trying to get high quality, reliable data, differentiating the level of exposures of lenders and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, for the resilience and stability facility, this tool adds to the IMF toolkit by offering affordable and long-term financing. The idea being that it plays the role as a catalyst to attract more sources of financing. And we've been collaborating with other organizations like the World Bank and other.
And to be concrete, the one in Morocco was recently done. They benefited from this facility. And for example, in that context, Morocco developed its national strategy for the ecological climate by 2030, the application of directives for the disclosure and reporting of financial risks relating to the climate, and these directives that I've also mentioned concerning the collection and reporting of exposure of major lenders to climate risks, which will include overseas or foreign subsidiaries. Thank you. Thank you, Amadou. I just want to go back to this transition risk, which in very exposed countries means a need to diversify in economic terms. But according to the IMF, is there a role for monetary policy, or is there a role for prudential policy to facilitate such diversification in economic terms, which is a necessity to deal with transitional risks? Sorry, I was saying it's a good question. I believe there is there isn't a policy for all these countries in transition. I think the discussion for the region I know best, Africa, was above all about adaptation and the lack of resources to adapt compared to attenuation and etc. When talking about the policy for transition risks, I don't think there's an established line. I think it's for one country to the next for the time being. But I'll work on that. It's a very good question. I know that the question is how to attract more financing to adaptation, given that even in Africa, even for African development banks, it would appear that most of the financing goes to attenuation. Thank you. And sorry for that trick question. It's homework for us. Now I'm going to go back to Laurent. I'm not going to ask him a trick question. We talked a lot about coordination, information exchange for the exchanges between central banks and regulators. There's the NGFS, for which Banque de France is a founding member. What can NGFS do and what should NGFS not do, which was an example of these new subjects of multilateral cooperation that are starting to change the financial architecture on an international scale. NGFS is a network of central banks, as I said before, that now includes some 138 central banks and supervisors, plus international institutions such as the IMF and the European Central Bank as well. There are several axes developed within the NGFS. The first is supervision. The idea is to develop the framework for supervising climate risks by explaining basically what we mean by that. Raphael talked about it before. It's the implementation of risk governance monitoring, indicators and metrics that we'll use to develop a strategy, and afterwards, concretely, how can it be applied from executive organ bodies up to operational staff that will distribute these credit facilities. This is one of the first approaches. The second block is to develop scenarios. The developed scenarios are intended to have twofold intention, and this first one is a stress test by theme. These are scenarios for major regions that can be applied to specific central banks that concerns physical risks. That's work done with specialist institutes in climate production and transition risks. The idea there is to share experience, make available all the data that might be useful to supervisors. What has been developed in particular recently are short-term scenarios. This addresses, I think this was mentioned, to the need to involve industry, because we cannot do this without industry. And what's important is that these exercises should be useful. And what was applied was a short-term scenario that addresses your request to be able to see for financial institutions the impact of such scenarios on horizons that are 5 years. Those are for a strategic framework, and also for the monetary policy parts, where there's an effort made to model. I believe the Sanabandi governor mentioned the need to improve models for our projections, our macroeconomic ones, to help in decision-making in monetary policies to integrate climate scenarios. And there's a third part, which is about responsible investment, and to see how central banks show how their non-monetary portfolios can allow them to take decisions and in what form, and set an example. I think the interest is, first of all, it's a form of exchange to share information. There's a major effort made in training, human capital, therefore. So it's pooling, really, of resources and means to develop all the tools that are useful for central banks and supervisors. Well, thank you. I believe we've got half an hour before the governor of the Banque de France will come and close this discussion. We have half an hour for questions. And first of all, I'll give priority to people in the room.
Alors, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I am Senaz Yaglé from CIO. And before anything else, I'd like to say, on behalf of Jean-Claude Cassibeau, the governor, thank the Banque de France, FERDI, and the FD for inviting us to this conference. I wanted to give the perspective of the BCAO about this issue without mentioning everything that's already been said by the governors and by Mr. C. I want to say that the central bank is working currently on a project on a strategy based on 5 axes. The first concerns enhancing and reinforcing capacity, because we think it's one of the important factors to better understand the issue and be able better to address it. And we at the central bank, we profited from our participation as members of the NGFS, where we learned many things. And today, the Centre West African Formation d'études bancaires has modules not only for bank staff, but also for staff members of our subjects in our credit institutions to raise awareness about this issue. The second axis is data collection. And there again, no relevant policy can be made without the data. And so it's a very important factor where the central bank has worked on. 2 other axes mentioned were monetary policy. I won't go back to that. And also bank supervision and financial stability that have also been outlined. I just want to remind you that the central bank has already integrated in its stress tests all climate issues, because we measure banks' exposure to the agricultural sector to assess the banking sector's resilience in this area. That's another important factor. And the final axis concerns the bank's operations, how to reduce its own carbon footprint, and the bank has already do so in the renovation work it's doing. It takes account of all the issues relating to the energy, how to take account of this in its operations. So there is a specific feature about the continent, as the 2 governors and Mr. C mentioned. It's the role that central banks in Africa can play in this chain, starting with the private sector companies, the banking sector, public development banks, because in Africa, we don't have just cost of resources problems. The access to resources is problematical. And last week, I was in a forum where you've got project sponsors coming along, explaining their projects that are, let's call them green. But the real concern is their ability to access resources. And there again, the central bank has a role to play to regulate the sector, admittedly, but also to offer motivation to facilitate access to bank financing for companies, because most of the companies we deal with are small to medium-sized businesses without access to banking services, that cannot go onto the market to raise resources. So it's important to offer this motivation through the central bank. So I don't want to be too long. That's just our insight, our take on this, and I'm delighted to have taken part in this discussion.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
De cette intervention.
Thank you for the speech. Perhaps, governors, you would like to point out, you'd like to react to this, what kind of interest or what kind of motivation we can do to facilitate access to green projects. I want to go back to what I was saying before. Our central bank in Madagascar is joining an African Guarantee Association and implementing this kind of guarantee, which will be used by commercial banks. We want to encourage banks to support projects, green projects, whatever they may be, but there must already be a list of these such projects. And if it's compliant with this, then the interest rates should be lower because they'll be guaranteed upon demand. That's what the central bank is offering to the market. In that case, these initiatives will be really supported with lower rates compared to the market. We believe that these initiatives would really have an impact on society. In Madagascar, as you know, we have a dilemma. We use natural resources to have dams. But we never thought that water would dry up, but that's no longer the case. We have a dam that we implemented, we built several decades ago, and now systematically, every year, the water dries up. And when the water dries up, there's no energy left. And when there's no energy, private companies that are productive can no longer work, which leads us to looking at other heat sources of energy. But as soon as we talk about this, in Madagascar, oil and diesel is already a problematic source of energy. So the increase and variation in international oil prices impacts Madagascar twice. Energy for transport is also in there, but energy in itself, just to generate electricity, that should be supporting companies and becomes basically a social crisis in Madagascar, because we have to realize when there's no energy, water no longer works because you've got an electric pressure regulator, which is electric, and it's basically a vicious circle that the local population is incurring. So for us in Madagascar, it means a threefold impact. No more electricity, transportation is difficult, and even the water we want to drink is problematic. So in this sense, the central bank wants to support initiatives for green energy, solar powered, for example, through these genuine guarantees offered to commercial banks to support companies. And for me, we have to reduce our dependency on hydraulic energy, because water is diminishing by volume, and aim at solar power. And I hope that will never happen where there's no more sunshine, because then we'll really have a problem. And in Madagascar, I think we have 90% of the year has sunshine. We have a minimum of 300 days a year of sunshine. So there we're converging with this energy transformation. And therefore, we at the central bank, we're really in the process of negotiating this guarantee fund, which will be installed in Madagascar. And once it's there, we'll encourage banks to grant loans with really lower rates, or at least divided by 2 for renewable energy initiatives. But in that sense, the need will fall, and we hope ultimately that energy should be sufficient in Madagascar to support production. In that sense, the central bank's initiative is really important for the Malgache economy. The central bank will directly financing the guarantee fund, will join the guarantee fund, and once we've joined, the guarantee fund will be implemented in Madagascar to guarantee loans for individuals or for companies or investment guarantees. Thank you. Do you have a point to make, Governor?
Oui, tout à fait. Je pense
Yes,
que
indeed. I believe
au niveau de la zone CEMAC, même l'an
that for
dernier,
the
nous
CEMAC
avons eu
zone last year,
de réunions de très
we
haut
had
niveau avec
very high-level meetings
les ministres siégeant dans l'Union économique d'Afrique centrale où les
of ministers
questions
of the African Union, Economic Union,
liées
and considered the consequences
climatique a été
of
évoquées puisque
climate change because they were
on
mentioned
venait
as
de
we had just
connaître les inondations
experienced
au
flooding
niveau du Tchad,
in Chad,
au nord du Cameroun
northern Cameroon,
et en Centrafrique.
and Central African
Et la
Republic.
Banque centrale avait
And the
appelé
Central
la
Bank
création d'un fonds,
had asked for
des
a fund to
fonds
be,
communautaires
a community fund
de
to be created
résilience.
for
Le
resilience.
constat était
The
que,
observation made was that
étant donné tous les 6 pays
given
qui
that
constituent une
all
zone
6
économique et
countries that
monétaire,
comprise the economic and monetary zone,
les changements climatiques ont
when
des
climate
impacts
change
dans chacun des pays,
has an impact
le
on each of these
recours
countries,
est
the
vite
use,
fait à l'international.
we very
au
quickly
niveau
go to
régional.
international
Et
and
nous
regional
avons jugé
aid,
qu'il était
and we
important,
considered
ne
that it was
serait-ce que
important,
pour
if only for
disposer des ressources et
ensuring
assister
resources
les sinistrés,
and helping
des
the victims
populations
of these
où
catastrophes,
les
local
plantations ont
populations
été totalement ravagées.
where
Au
their
niveau du
lands
Tchad,
had been completely
les
ravaged.
ponts ont été dégradés, les
In
routes sont totalement
Chad,
coupées.
bridges had been
Et en
damaged, roads had been cut,
attendant une mobilisation
and
internationale,
waiting in pending
solidairement, il est plus
community
indiqué
solidarity,
que,
international
voilà, les
mobility,
voisins,
involvement,
que nous disposons ce fonds
we wanted
pour
to say
pouvoir
we had this
assister.
fund
Donc ça,
to be able to
c'est
help.
une des initiatives
That's one of the initiatives
qui est aujourd'hui en cours
which is
d'étude
currently
au
under
niveau
study
de la commission
at the level of
la
the
CEMAC.
commission of the CEMAC.
Donc nous y travaillons, on va voir
We are working on this.
l'architecture qu'il faut mettre en place.
We're looking at the architecture to be implemented
les contributions au
for
fonctionnement de
contributions
ce
to
fonds.
the
C'est déjà un fonds
point.
de premier secours.
It's already
aux
a
sinistrés.
first aid fund.
Secondo, nous voulons également
As a second
rappeler
action,
ici que
we
la
want
zone CEMAC, c'est
to
une
remind you all
économie
that
dominée
the
par le secteur informel.
CEMAC
Donc,
area
que,
is a set of economies which
les actifs ne
are
sont pas
dominated
couverts par
by
des assurances.
informal
Et
businesses and
tout
operations,
l'impact,
which assets are not covered by
sur
insurance policy. And this is
le-
why there is a
l'inflation
very
et notamment
huge
sur les cadres
impact with
macroéconomiques. Donc,
inflation
c'est ça,
and
notamment
the
surveillance de certains risques
macroeconomic
climatiques, des
framework.
opérateurs,
So it's important that there is supervision of these climate-related risks because the operators are the ones, or the intermediaries are the ones which provide coverage and insurance against these risks, which is deplorable in our countries now. I would like to go back to what was said about the initiative taken by the central bank. I told you that we have a service to finance projects, and a study is currently being developed to include a green funding scheme. Now, the green funding scheme will use the same mechanism as for the funding of other operational and productive projects, which are not necessarily carried out by the entrepreneurs or the project leaders, but which are basically carried out by the banks, and where the responsibility and liability lies with the banks, with a criteria for eligibility for these projects, which are managed by this central bank-backed scheme. And for low carbon footprint projects, for example, or low carbon or other green projects, which are considered as more resilient, quote unquote, in the context of transitioning, then the scheme can support and help fund such projects. So this instrument and this new system is being developed and will be submitted to the approving bodies, including the central bank, for it to be adopted soon. So this is one of the actions we want to implement to contribute to transitioning. And I also would like to come back on one aspect. Today, as we all know well, Central Africa is the second source of green resources for the company. Now, what is happening now with respect to the protection of this green source of resources? And the states are the ones who call on and expect a lot from the international community, expecting carbon credits, which are not on a par with the needs, knowing that the economic growth rate has remained very sluggish, very low, especially in Central Africa. In Western Africa, it's different. They are showing growth rates in the order of 6 to 8%. In Central Africa, growth is around 2%. It was 2.7% 2024, and it was a 2.6% growth rate in 2025. So the growth rate remains very low, which reflects the vulnerability of our Central African Europeans, which are fully dependent on imports. Having said that, the growth rate of our demographies, our demographic growth rate has been exponential. So with urban development, which has exerted the pressure on the green and forest spaces, jeopardizing this green lung, this green source of resources. This is why it is important to promote resilient projects. With this rapid increase in the population is generating pressure, which in turn generates deforestation, because timber is heat resources. So generation of gas, considering the environmental transition, it is important that we take into consideration the issue of destruction of forest. Which way should we go? You know, this is an equation which is difficult to solve, because the environmentalists will say, no, we cannot tap into the green forest resources, but we have an anarchical development of our towns and municipalities, which is exerting pressure on these green resources. This is where strategic decisions have to be made. Now, which resilient projects should be promoted as a priority, with which incentives, knowing that we want to implement incentives in the context of this green scheme. So it's both my contribution and also my question. Well, Thank you for mentioning these trade-offs and arbitration, although there is convergence between development policies and climate-related response policies. Any other questions? Thank you very much for your insights. Thank you for you, Mr. Cabriac, for your moderation, and thank you to the panelists. My question is on risk analysis. You explained very well that as supervisors or central bankers, you were a risk taker, and the way central bankers can influence the purchasing of green bonds or develop green bonds is by way of risk analysis. Yet risk analysis remains very much connected with the rating levels of rating agencies, be it in the field of supervision, but also this is true in the analysis of collaterals. So my question is to know how you view the work done by and the role of rating agencies to take this risk into consideration, because it will have an impact on how the central bankers and central supervisors assess these risks. And if you were to consider that these risks are not properly assessed, then do you have mechanisms in place to remedy inappropriate assessments of these risks by rating agencies? Oh, I'm not sure who would like to answer this question. Raphaël, would you? Thank you for this relevant question. Well, I don't consider it is a trap question. This is of great importance. As you mentioned, with respect to rating corporates, rating agencies do not always take into consideration transitioning and physical risks. But if you heard me well, and I'm sure you did, these are critical factors associated with the Pillar 1 requirements. If you want to have a risk analysis to determine shareholders' equity appropriately, it is important that rating agencies take these factors into consideration. Now, some positive points here. I don't want you all to get depressed, but lately there's been marked interest by many rating agencies for these parameters. I liked what you said, sir, when you spoke about the data. And you said that the quality of the data was one of the first priorities for the Central Bank of Western African States. Well, this is of extremely great importance, and this is extremely important for rating agencies, because without reliable data, whether it be climate related or with other financial risks, you cannot get a comprehensive and reliable analysis. There are several answers to this. It involves disclosures and non-financial reporting systems. We spoke about the responsibility of central bankers, but it's important to emphasize that the banks have their own degree of responsibility to be open and transparent in their risk assessments. And if you look at non-financial reports, there is a tendency to over-communicating and positively communicating, showcasing everything positive which has been done for the planet, ignoring or sidelining their exposure to transitioning and climate-related risk. And the more this data is quantitative and granular, the more these rating agencies can extract this data and can influence their rating systems and processes. So this is a work in process. I would like to say that Banque de France started to do this and started implementing a scoring system which takes into account the positive climate risk which can be onboarded by the banks for rating their client risk. I will wrap up and respond to you and your question, i.e. what should be done when these mechanisms are not existent, banks and supervisors. That is, I don't want to be too polemic, but let me say that before we wonder for the small banks among us as to what are the appropriate stress tests and the best possible modeling system. It's important that we have the right and reliable data, but that we have the right and appropriate risk management systems. It's important. So the credit allocation process does not need to be quantitative to positively impact the risk analysis. Without a scoring, it is possible to manage your risk and to manage your credit in a very appropriate manner across lots of types of credits and loans. So there are the means for banks to circumvent or to go over the scoring systems if they have robust risk analysis and risk control systems. Amadou Sy, would you like to respond to that? Not necessarily, but really rating agencies are very clear in what they say. They basically say that they are providing opinions, quote unquote, just opinions. And I fully agree that more openness and transparency should be obtained, and systems should be developed to use these ratings from rating agencies as one more instrument to appropriate risk management systems and strategies. I think that all these risks are interconnected, so a multi-dimensional approach. And at FERDI, we are trying to come up with a multi-dimensional approach to vulnerability. Such a multi-dimensional approach could provide data to the rating agencies as to how these risks are correlated and how these risks are taken into consideration by the ecosystem, i.e. to assess the degree of resilience and how this reflects in the final risk assessment. Do we have questions online?
Bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. I would like to pick up on some aspects which were mentioned. One question which was responded to by the two central bankers was that of those financial instruments to help environmental efficient bank in their financing. Maybe the IMF has experience outside of African regions around such experiences. Second type of question was on the reporting systems used by banks. There was another question as to know what are the reporting requirements for African banks towards their central banks. And if I may, above and beyond their requirements, how are these requirements applied and met, and do central banks find it difficult to get such information which needs to be reported back to them? And also a question on incentives, but Bruno Cabriec mentioned that. I believe that the governor of Banque de France has just arrived to wrap up this conference, but I will let you, governors, respond to the questions asked by Florian.
Effectivement, comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure,
indeed, as I already said, the Central Bank of Madagascar, by way of its Banking Supervision Committee, is currently working to readjust and optimize the reporting systems to report back to the central bank data on financings, credits, loans, and initiatives taken by the commercial banks with their clients, so that at the level of the central bank, we can review and analyze such data and consequently adjust our guidelines and our directives. Now, in this process to improve our approaches, it is important that we onboard the green approaches as part of our RA connected with the Basel Initiative, because in the past we didn't take these aspects so much into consideration, but this emerged on the way, and we are currently thinking about how to integrate the bank's shareholder equity into the process. It is always useful to have these reporting systems, but it is the very business model of the analysis which should be done at the macroeconomic level and at the sector level, which should be readjusted in order to integrate the climate change related issues. Because without reliable data, without reliable numbers, without basic data, which is to be reported by the banks, no reliable decisions can be made, and the central banks cannot readjust their guidelines and their directive. This is what we've been doing with the improvements of this reporting system by banks. Well, I think that as part of the role as a banking supervisor, there's a key requirement in the CMAC zone that all banks and entities should report to the various financial aggregates as part of the prudential and supervisory requirements. And this reporting systems comes as an addition to on-site inspections and documentary inspections, which are regulatory being conducted so as to enable the Banking Commission to develop and draw up its own respective annual report, which is submitted to the relevant authorities. So this system has been working well, knowing that we cover 55 banks, and 49 of these banks are fulfilling all the terms and conditions under the supervisory and prudential requirements in the CMAC zone. As far as the other questions which were asked, I think that the various speakers covered these points. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Governor. In a few words, Mr. Governor of Banque de France, I will summarize what was said. The central banks and regulators cannot do everything, but can contribute to this combating against climate change. And I will give you immediately the floor so that you can tell us how Banque de France contributes. Thank you for welcoming me. I wanted to conclude this panel and pass on the general greeting and hello of Banque de France. I would like to welcome to France the two governors here. We meet on a regular basis in the context of the French-speaking community of central banks, which is very dear to me, and I can see friendly faces here. And Mr. Cabriac, of course, whom we meet regularly, as well as all the teams who organize this conference.
Perhaps to continue with what Bruno said, in fact, is to do a conclusion, three convictions that I think go back to basically what you were saying this afternoon. The first is that central banks and supervisors are legitimate in taking a concern in climate change. Now, that's something we all share, but it should be said again in the new world that we live in, and I'm thinking above all about America, where we see the effects over beyond what we're doing. I'm going to be a bit more specific about what we're saying. You know that famous mission creep of going beyond our mission. Why are we legitimate? Not because we have an environmental mandate, but because the importance of climate change is such that it impacts our core business, the stability of prices and the economic cycle. We've seen this. in extreme climate events. We see this increasingly often, and it impacts financial stability. That's the role of a supervisor that you mentioned before. And so, with that said, I think Bruno is well said, put this very nicely. We can't do everything. Sometimes you've got this illusion that on the other side saying that, well, climate change will be resolved by central banks. And we're being accorded powers we do not actually have. But we do have a role to play in climate change and above all to take account of it, to look at price stability and financial stability. The second conviction is that means that it's an international combat, and it must be one with solidarity, particularly with Africa. Now, as you know, in Banque de France, we have committed this. We started 2017, when America first withdrew from the Paris Agreement. We set up the NGFS, Network for Greening the Financial System. I'd like to remind you its success. It's been quite successful in quantitative terms. We started off as 8, and there are now 138, including 27 central banks in Africa and supervisors. And one of the essential tasks of GFS is to work on scenarios of macroeconomic effects for climate change. We published this year scenarios that are relatively short term, in other words, for 2030. Before, we were up to 2050, which weren't particularly insightful. And we looked at the costs that would be associated by 2030 of extreme climate events. Unfortunately, that reality proves us that it is not empty words. The results are quite striking. When we look at Africa, we've seen 12.5% of loss of African GDP in the event of specific events. That's practically the double of the cost that we get to of the other regions we studied. Now, 6 or 7%, which is already very significant for them, but 12.5% for Africa. And there we can see the essential challenge. Why should we take a very serious look at climate change in Africa? Because it really does affect the economies in Africa. And as I've just said, it's also very important because this change is global. And we're talking about a public good that will affect all regions. Does the governor of Madagascar will allow me to quote him at one of our meetings? I don't know if you recall, it was in Brussels. We talked about climate change. The governor of the Madagascar Bank didn't say we shouldn't add to all the injustices incurred by Africa that of climate change, which struck me. This leads me to my third conviction, and I will be very brief. What can we and what must we do to work harder against climate change in Africa? Of course, mobilize funds. And we know that the mobilization of funds is not at on a par with needs, nor with what was actually promised. Beyond that global emission, what was also quite striking is that there are few private funds, much than we thought. There are few non-debt funds. The debt proportion is much higher than elsewhere. Now, this can be internal funds, domestic savers, as well as external funds. Today, there are few internal funds. I think 90% of funds, or climate funds in Africa, come from outside that wish to develop domestic resources. I know that people are doing this. It doesn't just concern climate change, but it is, of course, desirable. Now, this is a point I want to really emphasize in more detail. How can we develop blended finance? Sorry for speaking in English while speaking French. So for multilateral or specific public development banks are there. When we're talking about mobilizing private funds, I think there is a lever which we could use more, as I'm sure you know, Banque de France, the ACPR, French authorities launched a task to see if we could adapt some prudential rules so that when there is a guarantee from a multilateral development bank, for example, prudential requirements associated with private funds should not be too high. So we should take account of that guarantee. I wish to pay tribute to the work of the joint finance thing through the Agence Française de Développement. I was actually involved in this at the Cape in South Africa at a fantastic event organized by some of you were there. But there were about 1,000 people in the auditorium convinced by this cause. I spoke about our work that was quite exploratory at that stage, how to use the guarantee from public institutions to reduce specific prudential requirements in private funds, that it's not in light of a political decision, just we consider that there are fewer risks. And as you know, a lot of work is carrying on as for the 4P summits, the Sevilla summit. But I think there is that's one driver. But I'm going to stop there because I know we have to stick to our timetable. But I really wanted to say how I want to express my friendship to a number of you and the fact that we share a lot of convictions. It's a cause of common interest and it's a cause that concerns central banks, even though that some might say to us, we should stick to that direction, climate change, which is a political denial, for example, in the US, with the Trump administration, which has made things redress. It has made actually climate risks reduce. On the contrary, I'd say, I think we are doing our duty. We are not in politics. We are in what the central banks do, fidelity to with their mandate.